The cold moved differently in the Montana foothills in the winter of 1887. It didn't just settle, it pressed. It crept into log seams, froze water buckets solid, and turned every breath into a white cloud that hung in the air like a warning. Before sunrise, the world outside cracked with tiny sounds, sap exploding inside trees, frost shearing off fence rails, horses stamping to keep their blood from slowing. Inside Jakob Rudzinski's unfinished cabin, something strange sat in the corner. Not the glossy black iron stove every homesteader swore by, but a squat, heavy-built box of stone, brick, and clay. A stove that looked more like a collapsed bread oven than a frontier heater. Amos Calder stood in the open doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, staring with disbelief. "Jakob," he said, shaking his head, "that thing ain't a stove. That is a tombstone you're fixin' to heat your cabin with." Jakob didn't look up from the clay he was smoothing across the stove's core. "It'll burn hotter than iron," he said quietly. "Hotter? Son, it won't burn at all." Elias Boone, the young trapper who'd wandered in behind Amos, muttered under his breath, "Never seen a stove made of dirt before." Everyone in the valley thought Jakob was out of his mind. Winter was tightening early, temperatures already dropping fast, and here he was, packing 1,000 pounds of clay into a firebox instead of buying a proper cast-iron heater from the catalog. No one knew it yet, but before the season was over, Jakob's clay core stove would be the only thing standing between the valley and the deadly cold. The first true cold of the season arrived with a kind of quiet violence. Frost crept across the Montana foothills in white veins, settling over the cabins, barns, and uncut hay as if the land were turning to stone. Even before sunrise, the air felt heavy, dense, in a way that made every exhale linger longer than it should. That same morning, Jakob Rudzinski stepped into Calder's general store, boots leaving a trail of powder behind him. The warmth inside hit him like a wall. The iron stove in the corner glowed red along its seams, pinging softly as it expanded. Several men stood around it, soaking in the heat like cattle around a salt block. Amos Calder, storekeeper and loudest voice in town, leaned on the counter with the confidence of a man backed by iron and convention. Jakob approached quietly, unfolded a small slip of paper, and placed it on the wood. The list was short: sheet steel, rod, 2 hinges, and a grate. Not the items anyone expected to see this time of year. A few of the men drifted closer, curious. Amos lifted the list, brow tightening. "That what you're building your heater out of?" Jakob nodded once. "Yes, that's all I need." A murmur ran through the room. Some shook their heads, others smirked. There was familiarity in their faces, the look people get when they think they understand more than the man standing in front of them. No one spoke outright, but the meaning was clear. It's winter. Buy a real stove. Jakob felt the weight of it, but he remained steady. He gestured subtly toward the iron stove glowing in the corner. Thin metal, fast heat, quick loss. He had seen it in a dozen villages before he ever crossed the ocean. In his father's home, the heat of a winter fire lasted deep into the night. Stone, brick, and clay holding the warmth long after the flames died. The memory rose like a momentary ember, his father lifting him onto the warm masonry bed during a blizzard saying, "A stove should hold the night." He accepted the metal pieces from Amos without argument. The room was quiet enough to hear the hinge pins clink together. Elias Boone, a young trapper lingering near the shelves, studied Jakob rather than mocking him. "You really think clay can carry a winter out here?" His tone wasn't dismissive, more curious than anything. Jakob gave a small nod. "Clay holds heat differently." It was the only explanation he offered. On his walk back to the cabin, the wind stiffened. Trees groaned as old frost cracked across their bark. Snow stung his cheeks and settled on his coat in a thin crust. Inside the unfinished cabin, the stove he'd begun assembling waited in the corner. Not elegant, not shiny, just an iron shell with a hollow center meant for brick and packed clay. The tools lay neatly beside it. Buckets of river clay sat near the hearth line, stiff and cold from the night. Jakob removed his gloves and pressed a handful of clay between his palms. The material responded slowly, cold, resistant at first, but warming enough to shape. He worked methodically, pressing it into the core brick by brick, layer by layer. No audience here, no murmurs of judgment, only the rhythmic scrape of his trowel and the steady beat of wind outside. His father's words echoed again, not as sentiment, but as instruction. "Heat the mass, let the mass heat the room." Jakob paused only once, listening to the settling timbers of his cabin. The place still felt new, still smelled of cut logs and sawdust, still untested, like the stove he was building. Beyond the window, the sky darkened with early winter clouds, thick, unmoving, promising something harsher on the way. He resumed packing clay into the core, each handful firm, deliberate, purposeful. Whatever the others thought, the stove would prove itself soon enough. Winter always demanded proof. The next days settled into a deepening cold, the kind that stiffened leather and split firewood with hairline fractures before the axe even touched it. Jacob worked alone inside his cabin, the half-built stove standing like a small monument of iron and brick in the corner. The air inside was barely warmer than the air outside, frost lifting in faint curls around the window seams. He crouched beside the iron shell, running his hands over the brick structure he'd started. Every piece had to fit tightly. Every gap mattered. A stove like this wasn't just a heater. It was a vessel that relied on mass, pressure, and pathways. Clay remembered heat only when its body was unified. He mixed the clay in a wooden trough, local river clay, sifted sand, a pinch of straw. The mixture made a sound like wet rope dragging through mud. When he lifted it with his trowel, it held its shape just long enough before sagging. Perfect. Outside, boots crunched, snow shifted. Jacob looked up as the door swung open and Amos stepped inside without knocking. A gust of cold followed him in. "What in heaven's name?" Amos muttered, staring at the buckets of clay lining the wall. "You're really going through with this." Jacob didn't answer immediately. He pressed clay against the inner brick layer, smoothing it with slow, firm strokes. "Yes," he said finally. Amos wandered closer, hands rubbing against the cold. "Montana ain't Poland. Clay's gonna freeze, crack, fall apart. Then what? You gonna heat this place by wishing it warm?" Jacob paused his work, looking at the man only long enough to acknowledge the concern behind the bite. "The clay won't freeze once the stove is cured." Amos snorted. "Cured? You talk like it's a sick horse." Jacob resumed smoothing. "Cured means fired, hardened by heat. It becomes stone." Amos eyed the incomplete structure, the hollow core waiting for shape. He didn't argue further, but the skepticism sat on his shoulders like extra snow. After a moment he left, the door shutting with a dull thud. A lighter set of steps approached next. Elias Boone peeked inside, only his face visible beneath his fur-lined cap. "He's worried," Elias said quietly. "They all are. Winter's coming rough this year." Jacob simply nodded. "This stove will hold." "How can clay do that?" Elias asked. Jacob pointed to the thickening walls. "Clay absorbs heat slowly, but once it's full it holds it longer than iron. Iron gets hot fast, only to lose it fast." Elias stepped closer, trying to feel the structure as if the truth would reveal itself under his palm. "Never seen anything like it," he murmured. "You will," Jacob said, "when the first fire runs through." Elias left soon after, leaving Jacob alone with his work again. The cabin felt quieter without voices, only the scrape of trowel against brick, the soft thump of clay slapped into place, and the wind chewing at the chinking from the outside. That night, a problem revealed itself. The temperature in the cabin dropped to near zero. The clay he had shaped the day before stiffened too fast, drying unevenly. Small fissures formed along the unfinished surface. Jacob knelt, studying them in the lantern light. The cracks were shallow, but they warned him of what the frontier cold could do if he didn't fire the clay early enough. He frowned. In his father's village, the clay stoves were dried in warm barns, or with steady hearth heat, conditions he didn't have. He improvised. He built a tent of canvas and scrap wood over the stove, sealing it as best he could. Then he lit a small bed of coals beneath the shell, just enough to warm the air, not enough to harden the clay too fast. All night, the stove breathed gentle heat under its canvas shroud, curing from the inside out. By morning, the clay felt different, firmer, denser, no new cracks. Jacob stepped back, rubbing the stiffness from his hands. The core was beginning to take shape, not beautiful, not polished, but strong. Outside, the wind sharpened again. Snow began falling heavier than before. Winter was accelerating. So was the need for the stove to be finished. The wind changed the next morning, not in sound. Wind always had a voice in the Montana foothills, but in weight. It carried a colder note, sharper and metallic, the kind that seeped into the valley before anyone even opened their doors. Chimneys across the settlement sent up thin, hurried strands of smoke as families fed their iron stoves with whatever dry fuel they had left from autumn. Jakob woke to the groan of his log walls adjusting to the temperature drop. He sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his hands, and looked toward the stove. Last night's small test flame had burned itself out, leaving nothing but white ash and faint warmth along the clay surface. The air inside the cabin hung cold, but the stove still radiated a ghost of heat, proof the core had begun to store what little energy the flame had given it. He knelt and began preparing a larger fire. This one mattered. The first true burn would reveal whether the airflow changes had saved the stove or doomed it. Splits of fir, shaved kindling, and a small bundle of resin-rich twigs went into the chamber. He struck flint to steel. Sparks caught instantly, licking up the dry fibers, pulling them into flame. Jakob eased the stove door closed, watching through the narrow gap. The smoke lifted. It didn't hesitate. It didn't drift sideways. It rose strong and clean. Outside, boots crunched on the frozen path. Elias Boone appeared at the window, breath fogging the glass. A moment later, he stepped inside. "Saw the smoke going straight this time," he said, stamping the cold from his feet. "Looks like she's breathing right." Jakob nodded, eyes still on the flame. "Draft is alive." Elias warmed his hands near the stove, though the heat was faint. "Doesn't feel like much." "It isn't meant to," Jakob said. "Not yet." He tapped the side of the clay core. "This must warm slowly. When it does, it will stay warm." Outside, the wind rose again, long, whining gusts that rattled cabin shutters across the valley. Snow blew sideways, hitting the log walls with steady, needling pressure. Elias frowned. "Been hearing folks say this cold front is only the beginning." Jakob didn't answer. He fed thicker wood into the chamber and shut the door. The draft deepened with a low hum. The sound filled the cabin, not loud but steady, like a distant forge at work. Heat began to seep through the iron shell, warming the clay beneath. The air inside the cabin lifted a few degrees, then a few more. Minutes stretched into an hour. By then, Elias had shed his gloves, surprised by how quickly the space became livable. At midday, Amos approached. He pushed the door open without knocking, a habit of frontier men who assumed permission unless told otherwise. Snow fell off his coat in clumps. "You testing that stove again?" Jakob stepped aside. "It holds draft now." Amos approached the stove cautiously, one hand hovering above the steel. He expected the blast of heat iron stoves gave. Instead, he found a slow, deep warmth, different from the sharp bite of metal. "Feels like it's coming from way inside it," he muttered. "It is," Jakob replied. "The clay is waking." Amos raised a brow. "Well, maybe it won't kill you after all." It was as close to approval as Jakob expected this early. But the weather was growing worse. Outside, the sky darkened to a gray-green shade, the color it took when storms prepared to smother the valley. Snowpack deepened by the hour. Iron stoves in nearby cabins roared, fed constantly by anxious families who could feel the cold pressing through their walls. Elias looked out the window. "Front's moving fast. Another night like this and people will be burning twice the wood." Jakob added one last round of fire to the chamber, then shut the stove door firmly. The flame inside roared, bounced down the channels, and began saturating the clay from within. He could feel it through the floorboards. A slow shift, a building presence. This was the moment the stove crossed from theory into something real. By late afternoon, the cabin held steady warmth without needing constant feeding. Elias sat on a stool near the wall, noting how the heat didn't fade even when the fire dipped low. Jakob watched frost melt in lines along the windows. Not fast, not dramatically, but gradually, evenly. A sign the clay was doing its work. Outside, snow hammered the valley harder. Inside, the stove held its quiet, growing strength. The real test, Jakob knew, was coming at nightfall, and the weather promised no mercy. By evening, the storm had settled fully into the valley. Snow no longer fell in flakes. It arrived as a steady white curtain, erasing distance, blurring the lines between ground and sky. The sound of the wind shifted from intermittent gusts to a continuous low roar that threaded through the trees and around cabin corners like a living thing searching for weaknesses. Inside Jakob's cabin, the light had taken on a soft, orange tone. The clay core stove was ready for its first serious trial. Until now, every fire had been cautious. Small burns to test draft, to dry clay, to feel the first hints of stored heat. Tonight would be different. The temperature was dropping faster than he had expected. The frost on the inside of his window panes thickened visibly between one glance and the next. He began to prepare the burn. Thick rounds of fir, split and seasoned, lay stacked in a neat row along the wall. Jakob chose pieces deliberately, dense, heavy lengths with tight grain that would burn hot and long. He laid them into the chamber over a bed of kindling, building a fire meant to saturate the stove's entire body rather than simply warm its skin. When he lit it, the flames rose quickly, leaning toward the throat like they were being pulled by unseen hands. The draft caught with a deep, steady sound, no longer a tentative whisper, but a confident draw. Smoke vanished into the channels without hesitation. The stove began to change. At first, the warmth was familiar, like any heater slowly coming alive. Then, under the iron shell, the soaked clay started to accept the heat in full. The surface warmth grew denser, more solid, as if the core were filling up from the inside. Heat stopped feeling like something on the air and became something that lived in the mass of the stove. Jakob moved quietly around the cabin, watching for signs. He placed the back of his hand against the upper panel, then the lower, feeling for gradients. Heat spread downward and outward, the channels doing their work, carrying energy into the deepest parts of the core before releasing it back. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind drove snow against the logs with such force that faint powder sifted in where the walls had not yet fully settled. The temperature plunged. In other cabins, iron stoves would be burning red hot, air shimmering above their thin plates while heat fled up chimneys almost as fast as the wood could supply it. Here, the flame did something different. It worked quietly, almost modestly, feeding the clay. Elias Boone arrived just before full dark, shoulders dusted white, scarf stiff with frost. When Jakob opened the door, a blade of cold cut through the room so sharply that the warmth from the stove felt like a separate world. Elias stamped the snow from his boots and closed the door fast. He didn't say much. His eyes took in the color of the stove, the faint dull glow around the fire door, the way warmth lingered evenly across the room instead of pooling near the firebox and dying at the corners. He moved a hand over the surface but didn't press it hard, as if sensing that something deeper was happening beneath. "Feels solid," he murmured, almost to himself. Jakob only nodded. The hours moved slowly. He kept the fire at a controlled, vigorous burn, feeding it just enough to maintain bright coals without sending unnecessary heat up the chimney. The stove responded steadily. Clay expanded almost imperceptibly, tiny seams tightening rather than reacting with sharp, brittle cracks. He noticed one hairline fracture forming near a corner where the clay layer was thinner. Instead of panicking, he fetched a small bowl, mixed fresh clay with warm water by lantern light, and pressed it into the fissure while the surface was still hot. The patch bonded instantly, the moisture flashing into steam before dissipating. The crack did not widen. Outside, the night deepened into a kind of cold that crushed sound. The wind howled, but its edges felt blunted, distant, muted by snow. Inside, the cabin held a different kind of silence. No frantic poking of coals, no constant shoveling of wood, just the low, continuous murmur of burning and the slow expansion of a structure doing exactly what it had been shaped to do. By mid-evening, Jakob let the fire fall. Not out, but down. He closed the air intake, damped the burn, and watched the flames shrink to a bed of dense, glowing coals. The draft softened, then steadied again, still pulling, still breathing. The temperature in the room didn't slip. If anything, it became more even, more settled, as the clay shifted from absorbing to releasing. He checked the windows. Earlier in the day, frost had crept inwards, forming thick patterns along the glass edges. Now those lines had retreated. A narrow, clear band had appeared around the frames. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't shout success. But it was evidence. The air near the walls was warmer than it had been, heated not by hot gusts from a thin stove, but by a consistent, deeply sourced radiation. The cabin floor, which had been brutally cold since he first raised the walls, felt different through his socks. Not warm exactly, but no longer biting. The lowest air had begun to rise. He sat on a simple wooden chair a few feet from the stove and waited. That was the real test. What happened after the fire no longer demanded his attention. Time slipped past. The coals dimmed. The last visible flame disappeared behind the iron door. Yet the warmth held. An hour later, Jakob already knew. The stove had entered a new state. No longer just a vessel for burning, but a slow, deliberate reservoir. Its clay remembered the hours of firing and had no intention of forgetting quickly. Outside, the storm sharpened. Snow built in drifts against walls and doors. Trees bent under the weight. Inside, in one small cabin in the Montana dark, the temperature stayed almost unchanged. The first deep burn was over. The real cold hadn't truly begun. The cold that came next did not creep. It dropped. One morning, Jakob stepped outside to empty a bucket and felt the air hit him like a physical blow. His breath turned to ice so fast it seemed to vanish. The snow under his boots squealed, not crunched. a thin, glassy sound that only happened when the temperature plunged well below anything human bodies liked to endure. The thermometer nailed to his outer wall read -32 degrees Fahrenheit just after sunrise. By noon, it hadn't moved. Smoke from the other cabins went almost straight up, then flattened under an invisible ceiling, hanging low over the tree line in a pale, dirty layer. Nothing moved unless it had to. Horses stood with their backs to the wind, heads low. Chickens stayed huddled in corners of their coops, feathers puffed and useless. In most cabins, iron stoves were already glowing a dull red along their seams. Inside Jacob's cabin, the clay core stove still held last night's heat. He woke to air that felt cool but not cruel. His breath showed in front of him, yes, but faintly, not as a warning sign. When he swung his legs over the side of the bed and set his feet on the floor, the boards didn't bite the way they had in early autumn. The cold at ground level was being pushed back. He walked to the stove and put his palm flat against its iron skin. It felt warm, not burning, not sharp, but steady. The fire had gone out hours ago. He opened the door. Only gray ash and the faint outline of charcoal remained. The core was doing the work now. He loaded a smaller morning fire, just enough to resaturate what the night had drawn down. The flame caught easily. Draft came alive with its now familiar low hum. He stepped back, listening. There was a rhythm to it now, a breathing pattern that matched the stove's new reality as less of a fireplace and more of a slow, beating heart of the cabin. By midday, the outside temperature fell further. Word began to drift in with the wind. Elias arrived first, his face raw with cold, eyes red-rimmed from the stinging air. He stomped inside, teeth clicking as they settled from the shock. "Amos's stove is running full red," he said without preamble. "He's feeding it like a sawmill furnace and still can't get his place above 50. Jacob glanced at the thermometer nailed just inside his door. It hovered around 63. He said nothing at first. Elias moved closer to the stove, holding his hands above it, letting the deep warmth sink in. "Yours don't even look hot," he added, almost accusingly. "It's hot inside," Jacob replied. "The clay is holding the fire for me." Elias frowned, trying to reconcile what he felt with what he saw. "In the other cabins, you've got to stand close to the box or your back freezes. Here." He turned slowly, feeling the air. "It's the same on the far wall as it is near the stove." Jacob nodded once. "Heat should not be a circle around iron. It should be a field in the room." Outside, the wind shifted. The cabin creaked softly in response, logs adjusting to another drop in temperature. Somewhere down valley, a loud crack echoed, the sound of a tree splitting under cold strain. Elias winced at the noise. "Folks are scared," he said. "This ain't a normal freeze. They're burning through wood like it's nothing. Piles they cut for 2 months are vanishing in 3 days. He hesitated before adding, "Amos told me his stovetop's warped on one side, plates bowing out from the heat." Jacob paused at that. An iron stove overfired, over and over, had limits. Plates could only expand so much before something gave way. "Did he bank the fire at all?" Jacob asked. "No," Elias shook his head. "He can't. Says if he lets it die down, the cabin will go from 50 to near freezing in 3 hours. An engineering picture formed in Jacob's mind, not in numbers but in observations. Thin metal radiating heat violently into the air, that same air racing up the chimney with the smoke, cold creeping across floors and walls as soon as the fire's intensity dropped. Convection ruling everything, radiation barely given a chance. Elias sank onto a stool near the door, rubbing his hands. "Yours is different. It don't boom heat, it just stays." Jacob walked slowly to the window. Frost still traced lines down the glass, but it was patchy now. Small clearings had opened near the lower corners, where the cold air usually gathered first. The air next to the floor was warming, gently but undeniably. "Clay doesn't care how fast you feed it," Jacob said quietly. "It cares how deep you heat it." Elias watched him, brow knit. "You think this'll hold if it gets worse?" "It will," Jacob said, "if I fire it right." The next night proved that claim. The temperature dropped to -38 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley entered a kind of suspended life. People stayed inside unless duty dragged them out. Animals were checked on in short, brutal trips. Every iron stove burned white hot, consuming wood in a way that felt almost panicked. In Amos's cabin, the stove surface turned a frightening shade of red. Metal groaned. The air nearest it became almost too hot to stand in, while the far side of the room still clung to a cold edge. In Jakob's cabin, the day's last fire burned for 4 hours. He fed it carefully, never letting flames lick too far into the chimney, always pulling them back into the clay channels. When he closed the door for the final time that night, the core held more heat than he'd yet asked it to store. Outside, the world shifted into a deeper silence, the kind that didn't just feel cold, it felt dangerous. Inside, the air stayed around 67 degrees. The difference between those two numbers, inside and out, could not be smelled or heard. But it could be felt. In the absence of fear when Jakob lay down, in the way his breath didn't fog as heavily as it had in autumn, in the way the floor no longer punished bare feet. The big freeze of 87 was settling in for its long siege. Jakob's clay core stove was ready. The iron stoves, he knew, were already at their limits. The cold hit its worst sometime after midnight. Jakob felt it before he woke, an instinct more than a sensation, the way a cabin seems to tighten, the logs shrinking just slightly as their moisture froze hard inside them. The air had a metallic bite, the kind that meant the temperature had dropped far past what iron liked, far past what lungs liked. Then came the pounding, sharp, urgent, no rhythm, just fear. Jakob swung his legs out of bed, pulled on his coat, and opened the door. Amos nearly fell inside. His beard was stiff with white frost. His coat crackled as it bent. His breaths came shallow, fast, each one wheezing as though it hurt him. Jakob shut the door quickly to keep the cold from slicing deeper into the room. "Sit," he said quietly. "Catch your breath." Amos shook his head, though his body clearly wanted to collapse. "My stove. It's failing." His voice was rough, scraped thin by smoke and cold. "It blew back on us. Smoke everywhere. Fire went out. I couldn't clear it. Couldn't get it to draw." Jakob steadied him and lowered him to the chair near the warm stove. Even in the dim lantern glow, the clay core's gentle heat radiated into the room like a held breath. "How cold is your cabin?" Jakob asked. 40. Maybe less now." Amos rubbed at his eyes, but his hands shook so badly he couldn't stop. "My youngest was sobbing because her hands were numb. Anna tried to warm her by holding her close, but nothing helped. I had to take them to Elias's. Couldn't keep them there another minute." Jakob listened, feeling the weight of every word. He knew iron stoves pushed heat fast, too fast, and sometimes that speed came at a cost. They needed constant feeding because they lost energy the instant the fire weakened. Tonight was the kind of night that punished that design without mercy. He stood, grabbing his gloves. "We'll look." Amos rose unsteadily. "If it's dead, I don't know what I'll do." "Then it won't stay dead," Jakob said simply. They stepped out into air so cold it hurt instantly. Snow swirled in tight spirals, not drifting but driven, like sand in a storm. The two men pushed through it, leaning into gusts as they crossed the frozen path toward Amos's cabin. The door was half buried in a drift. Jakob forced it open. The cold inside felt worse than the cold outside. In the valley, the wind at least moved. Here, the stillness made it feel personal. Frost feathered the inner logs. A thin haze of old smoke clung in the ceiling corners. Jakob knelt in front of the stove. The iron plates were badly overheated. A faint warp bent the stovepipe just enough to break the draft. It didn't take much, just a slight bulge where the heat had pushed the metal past what it could tolerate. He opened the stove door. No glow, no coal bed, just ash and the last remnants of a failed fire. Amos crouched beside him. "Can it be fixed?" His voice was small, stripped of pride. "Not tonight," Jakob said. "Not in this cold. The pipe needs replacing, maybe more." Amos shut his eyes. "I was so sure mine would outlive that clay thing of yours." Jakob didn't bother with a response. The cold in the room was bitter enough. A lantern flickered at the door. Elias stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "Saw you two headed this way, thought you'd need help." Jakob stood, brushing frost from his coat. "We're taking him back. His cabin won't hold." Elias took one long look at the warped stovepipe. "Hell," he whispered. "Never seen metal shift like that." "It's the cold," Jakob said. "And the way he's had to overfire it. The iron can only take so much." Amos swallowed hard. "My family." "They're safe for tonight," Elias said. "But you won't be sleeping here again till this warms." Jakob nodded once. "Come on." The walk back felt longer. Amos barely spoke, except once when he muttered, "I mocked you for months." Jakob answered without looking over. "Mocking's cheap, cold isn't." Inside Jakob's cabin, the warmth met them instantly. Not a blast, not a wave, just a presence, gentle, even, unmistakably alive. Amos stopped dead in the doorway. "How is it this warm, with no fire burning?" Jakob tapped the clay core stove with 2 fingers. "It's still releasing yesterday's heat, the clay's full." Elias closed the door behind them. "Feels better than anywhere in the valley." Jakob knelt at the firebox and added wood for the next burn. In the morning, we start drawing plans for your system. You'll build one yourself come spring. Amos stared at the stove for a long moment, jaw clenched, throat tight. I don't deserve your help. You don't have to, Jacob replied. He lit the kindling with one clean spark. Cold winter like this, everyone deserves a chance to stay warm. Flames rose, the draft caught, and as the clay core stove absorbed new heat with the same slow confidence as before, the valley outside sank deeper into the worst freeze it had seen in decades. Jacob's cabin held steady at 67 degrees. Amos's future, for the first time that night, felt survivable. Winter eventually loosened its grip on the valley. The wind softened first, then the snowpack, then the light itself, returning color to a world that had lived too long in shades of white and iron blue. Cabins thawed, smoke thinned, people breathed easier. But the memory of the cold remained, etched into conversations, into the way neighbors checked their chimneys, into the new respect they carried for the quiet warmth inside Jacob's home. His clay core stove didn't roar. It didn't glow red or rage like the iron boxes that had burned themselves nearly to failure. It worked the way the land worked, slowly, steadily, storing strength, releasing it when needed. The winter had shown the truth without shouting it. Efficiency mattered more than spectacle, and deep knowledge mattered more than tradition. Men who once mocked Jacob's digging now asked where to lay their first stones. They came not because they wanted something new, but because the old way had cracked under pressure. And when the frontier tested a man, pride didn't matter, survival did. Jakob never lectured. He simply showed them, the narrow throat, the long channel paths, the clay packed in layers like sediment, the patience required to build something meant to last. One stove at a time, the valley changed, and as warmth returned to the land, the question lingered. In a world built on habit, would you have trusted the strange idea, the buried heat, the clay core, before the cold proved it right?